Chapter 6: Supply, Demand, and Government Policy. In this chapter, questions that we seek answers to are: what are price ceilings and price floors? What are some examples of each? How do price ceilings and price floors affect market outcomes? How do taxes affect market outcomes? How do the effect depend on whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers? What is the incidence of a tax? What determines the incidence? So let's look at government policies in details. Economists as policy advisors. Economists use theories to help change the world for the better. And policies often have effects that their architects did not intend or anticipate. Alter the private market outcome. They include price controls and taxes. Price ceilings. Let's look at price controls. Price ceiling is a price control, and it's defined as legal maximum on the price at which a good can be sold. Examples of price ceilings include rent control laws. Price floor, also a price control, is a legal minimum on the price at which a good can be sold. Examples of price floor would be minimum wage laws. If we ask the experts on their opinion on rent control, local ordinances that limit rent increases for some rental housing units, such as in New York and San Francisco, have had a positive impact over the past 3 decades on the amount and quality of broadly affordable rental housing in cities that have used them. Well, 95% of economists disagree. So price controls is really not a good idea, according to economists. Let's look at the market for apartments. On the vertical axis is rent control, and the horizontal axis is the apartment. There's demand, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, and the equilibrium price or equilibrium rent is 800, and equilibrium quantity is 300. That is equilibrium without price controls. So let's look at the effects of a non-binding price control. When price is set above equilibrium, in this example, if we set a price ceiling to be 1,000 and the equilibrium price or equilibrium rent is 800, then this is an example of a non-binding price ceiling. Okay, it will have no effect and the market will ignore it. So here the statement says a price ceiling above equilibrium price is not binding and has no effect on the market outcome. So here in this example, the price in the market will remain 800 and the quantity will remain 300. And that 1,000 price ceiling will have no effect. What about a binding price ceiling? When the price ceiling is set below equilibrium, 500 is below 800, that is a binding price ceiling. So if the equilibrium price is 8 and it is above the ceiling and therefore illegal, the price ceiling is binding and the result, it will cause a shortage in the market. That is a binding price ceiling. So here the shortage will be 400 apartments will be demanded, only 250 will be made available. There will be a shortage of 150, that is 400 minus 250. What about binding price in the long run? What effect does a binding price have on the market in the long run? In the long run, the supply and demand of rental apartments are more price elastic. So the shortage gets larger. When in the long run, the shortage is larger, the problem gets worse. So here in this example, in the long run, 450 will be demanded, 150 will be supplied, and that means the shortage has gotten larger by another 150, so that would be 300. Shortages and rationing. Because of shortages, sellers must retain the goods. Oh, I'm sorry. Sellers must ration the goods among buyers. Some rationing mechanisms include there will be long lines or long waiting lists, discrimination according to sellers' biases. You've got a lot of people wanting these houses, so you are able to discriminate, are often unfair and inefficient. The goods do not necessarily go to the buyers who value them most highly. So that means price control is not a good idea in this case. So, what about the market for unskilled labor? Here we measure wages as a price for labor on the vertical axis and quantity of unskilled workers on the horizontal axis. And then the downsloping demand and upsloping supply and equilibrium without price control, $9 an hour, and 500 people will be hired without the government stepping in. What does a non-binding price floor looks like? The market for unskilled labor will be a price floor will be non-binding if it is set below equilibrium. So if you set a wage at $7 as a price floor, it will be non-binding and the market will ignore it. So a price floor below the equilibrium price is not binding, has no effect on the market outcome, and therefore the wage will remain $9 and quantity of labor hired will be 500. What about a binding price floor? The price floor is binding if it is set above equilibrium. In this case, if equilibrium wage is $9, then if you set a price floor at $10.25, that is a binding price floor. So the equilibrium wage, which is 9, is below the floor and therefore it is legal. So the price floor is binding and it causes a surplus to emerge in the market. And in the labor market, that surplus is unemployed, people who are unemployed. So here, in this example, 550 people will be looking for a job, but only 400 will be hired, which means there will be a surplus of 150 people, and that is unemployment. Let's ask the experts again on minimum, their views on minimum wage. If the federal minimum wage is raised gradually to $15 per hour by 2020, the employment rate for low-wage U.S. workers will be substantially lower than it would be under the status quo. And here, there's no conclusive consensus among economists. 29% disagree with the statement, 37% are uncertain, and 34% agree. So the jury is still out. Minimum wage laws. Let's look at a case study. The minimum wage has its greatest impact on the market for teenage labor. Teenagers are the least skilled and least experienced. They should be willing to accept lower wage in exchange for on-the-job training. So a 10% increase in minimum wage decreases teenage employment by 1 to 3%. And we focus on the effects in the short run. Long-run effects are harder to estimate, but more relevant and likely larger. Long-run effects. Long-run effects. Increase in quantity supplied of labor, higher number of teenagers who choose to look for jobs. Long-run effects. Advocates of the minimum wage. One way to raise the income of working poor. Workers who earn the minimum wage can afford only a meager standard of living. What about opponents? What is the view of opponents of the minimum wage? Not the best way to combat poverty. And they state that it causes unemployment, encourages teenagers to drop out of school, prevents some unskilled workers from getting on the job training. Minimum wage workers are less than a third of minimum wage earners are in the families with incomes below the poverty line. Many are teenagers from middle class homes working at part time jobs for extra spending money. So it's really not going to help the poor people, the group for which it was intended. A learning exercise. The market for bicycles is in equilibrium, as in this graph. Determine the effects of a $90 price ceiling, a $90 price floor, and $120 price floor. So where is $90? $90 is below the equilibrium. And if the price ceiling is below equilibrium, it is going to be effective. And you should be able to calculate the shortage, 120 minus 90. What about number B, $90 price floor? The price floor set at $90, as of course we have seen, will be ignored by the market. You set the price floor below equilibrium, it will be ignored, and the market will settle at $100 price and quantity of 100. What about number C, 120 price floor? If the price is set above equilibrium, a price floor, that will be binding and it will cause a surplus. And if you set at $120, you will find that supply will be 120 and demand would be 60, and therefore the surplus would be 120 minus 60. And that is what is demonstrated here. Okay. Evaluating price controls. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Economists usually oppose price ceilings and price floors. Prices are not the outcome of some haphazard process. Prices have the crucial job of balancing supply and demand, coordinating economic activity. Government can sometimes improve market outcomes. Okay, and here the government wants to use price controls to improve market outcomes because of unfair market outcomes, and it is aimed at helping the poor. So the government means well, but it often hurts those they are trying to help. These government policies, even though they are intended to help the poor people, they end up hurting the poor people. Other ways of helping those in need would include rent subsidies would be a better option, and wage subsidies, or what we call earned income tax credit, would be preferred to straight price controls. Let's look at taxes. Government uses taxes to raise revenue for public projects like roads and schools and national defense. The tax incidence, that's the manner in which the burden of a tax is shared among participants in a market. The government can make the seller or a buyer to pay the tax. So here is an example of the market for pizza without equilibrium. So if there is no government, pizza will be sold for $10. The buyer will pay $10. The seller will receive $10, and 500 pizzas will be sold. What about if the government now imposes a tax on buyers? The effect of $1.50 per unit tax on buyers. The price buyers pay is now $1.50 higher than the market price. P, or price, would have to fall by $1.50 to make buyers willing to buy the same output as before. For example, if P falls from 10 to 850, buyers are willing to purchase 500 pizzas. And this is what shown. If you lower the price from 10 to 850, we will sell exactly the same amount of pizzas, that vertical distance being the tax. Hence, a tax on buyers will shift demand curve by the amount of the tax. The demand curve will shift down by $1.50. This is $1.50 right here. The new equilibrium will be 450. The market will shrink from 500 to 450. And the price the seller receives will decrease from $10 to $9.50. And the price a buyer pays will increase from $10 to $11. The difference between price that buyers pay, or PB, and price that sellers pay, or PS, is the tax. That is the wage. Tax incidence, which is how the burden of a tax is shared among the market participants. In this case, the market participants is the seller and the buyer. In this example, the buyer pays $1 more. The original price was 10, now the buyer is paying 11. The seller is receiving 50 cents less. So the tax effectively raises the seller's cost by $1.50 per pizza. Sellers will supply 500 pizzas only if price rises to $11.50. To compensate for this cost increase. This is now tax imposed on sellers. We're starting out with the market in equilibrium. We have just seen an example of $1.50 tax imposed on buyers. And we saw that the demand curve shifts down. The market shrinks and the tax is shared between the buyer and the seller. Now here, the tax is imposed on the seller. And we can see that the supply curve shifts. If the tax is imposed on the seller, the supply curve shifts up or to the left from S1 to S2 by the amount of the tax. The amount of the tax is $1.50. The new equilibrium would be 450. Again, the market shrinks from 500 to 450. And the buyer pays $11 instead of $10. The seller receives $9.50 instead of $10. The difference between them is $1.50, which is the tax. They have to write a check to the government of $1.50. The conclusion here is the outcome is the same in both cases. Whether the tax is imposed on a buyer or on a seller, the outcome is exactly the same. So the effects on P and Q and the tax incidence are the same whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. A tax drives a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. And in this case, the buyer will contribute $1 to the tax and the seller will contribute 50 cents to the tax. Active learning 2, effect of a tax. The market for bicycles is in equilibrium as in the graph. Suppose the government imposes a tax on buyers of $30 per bicycle. So you will identify a vertical line connecting demand and supply, and probably that will be the tax. Find the new quantity, price buyers pay, price sellers pay, and the incidence of tax. And that is the tax, $30. Okay, on the demand side at 110, on the supply side at 80, the difference is 30. So that is the wage, that is the tax the government imposes. So quantity would be 80. In other words, the market will shrink from 100, which was the equilibrium without the tax, down to 80. The price buyers pay will be 110. The price buyers pay is 110. The price sellers receive is 80. PS is 80. PB is 110. The incidence, which is who really pays the tax, is that the buyer contributes 10 and the seller contributes 20. The original equilibrium was 100. The buyer is now paying 110, so the buyer pays that $10 of the tax. And for a seller, the original equilibrium was 100. The seller now receives 80, so the seller contributes 20. That's the meaning of the incidence of tax. When a good is taxed, buyers and sellers of the good share the burden of the tax. But how exactly is the tax burden divided depends on the elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. So let's look at the case of elastic supply with inelastic demand. So you can see here, demand is fairly steep. That means demand is inelastic. And supply is relatively elastic, so a little bit flatter. The price with no tax, and now we impose the tax, which is that vertical distance joining demand and supply, and you extend that perpendicular to PS to establish what the seller will pay. extending from the supply curve. And this price that buyers will pay a perpendicular from demand curve. The buyer's share of the tax is the difference from the original equilibrium to the new price paid by the buyer. And the share of the tax paid by the seller is the difference from the original equilibrium to the price sellers receive. So, what was our conclusion? Okay, before we finish here, what was our conclusion here? It is easier for sellers than buyers to leave the market, so buyers bear most of the tax. Why? You can see here the burden of the tax falls heavily on buyers because buyers have inelastic demand. They don't have much of a choice. They can't go anywhere, so most of the tax is passed on to them. So anybody with inelastic demand will pay the larger portion of the tax. What about inelastic supply? Now, this is the opposite now. Supply is fairly steep, that is inelastic, and now demand is relatively elastic or flat. And we start out with the price without tax. Now, when we impose the tax, okay, you will see clearly who will pay most of the tax. Supply is more inelastic. This is the portion of the tax paid by the seller. So you can see that the, the buyer pays a smaller share of the tax because the buyer's demand is relatively elastic. The buyer has a choice. You can go anywhere to find this item. But the seller does not have much of a choice, so the seller will have to absorb most of the tax. As you can see, the share of the tax paid by the seller is larger than the share paid by the buyer. Why? Because of inelastic supply and elastic demand. It is easier for buyers than sellers to leave the market, so sellers bear most of the burden of the tax. Case study. Who pays the luxury tax? In 1990, Congress adopted a new luxury tax on yachts and private planes, furs, jewelry, expensive cars. The goal of this policy was to raise revenue from those who could most easily afford to pay the tax. The luxury items purchased by rich people, so those are the people who can afford to pay the tax. What we have seen from the previous example is that demand is elastic. If the demand is elastic, these people have a choice. And therefore, they're not going to pay much of the tax. Supply is relatively inelastic. And if the supply is inelastic, these are the people who are going to be stuck with the tax. So here, if we demonstrate this on the graph, that is an inelastic supply, okay, and a relatively elastic demand. And if tax is imposed on these luxury items, we will see that this is what the rich people's share of the tax burden. They don't pay much of that tax. This is the share of the seller's share of the tax. And these are the people who are hiring those poor people who are working minimum wage laws, and they're now stuck with a larger share of the tax. So the companies that build yachts are now paying most of the tax, as we have seen. Think, pay, and share. Suppose that your state needs to raise more tax revenues. The governor proposes a tax on food because everyone must eat, and thus a food tax would surely raise a great deal of tax revenue. He insists The tax should be placed on food sellers to protect the poor who spend a large portion of their income on food. Will the burden of a food tax fall only on the sellers of food, as the governor said? Explain. Who will bear most of this tax burden? Use an example of what we have gone through to explain yourself here. Chapter in a nutshell. A price ceiling is a legal maximum on the price of a good or a service. Examples are rent control. They're binding if it's below equilibrium price, a shortage will result. Sellers must in some way ration the good or service among buyers. A price floor is a legal minimum on the price of a good or service. An example is minimum wage, and it is binding if it is above equilibrium price and must result in a surplus. Buyers demands for the good or service must in some way be rationed among sellers. When the government levies a tax on a good, the equilibrium quantity of the good will fall. The tax places a wedge between the price paid by buyers and the price received by sellers. Buyers pay more of the good and sellers receive less of it. Buyers and sellers share the tax burden. The incidence of tax depends on the price elasticities of supply and demand. Most of the burden falls on the side of the market that is less elastic.